Hello, I am Paul Drinkwater. For most of my working life, I taught electronics to students in colleges and university, both in this country and overseas. But in my retirement, I joined the Gloucester Civic Trust and in 2010 trained as a tour guide, conducting tours around the city. Over the last few years for Heritage Open Days, I have researched, prepared and delivered a number of talks on people and places associated with Gloucester's rich heritage over our 2,000 years of history. In this talk, we will be looking at Dr. Walter Hadwen. For those of you who have heard of Dr. Hadwen, you are most likely to have formed the impression that he was a somewhat controversial figure who was opposed to vaccination around the time of outbreaks of smallpox in Gloucester around the turn of the 20th century. Well, he certainly was a thorn in the flesh to the medical establishment at that time. But there are always two sides to every story. Now, I like biographies because they tell us how other people live and how they face the challenges that life presents and compares them to our own lives. The purpose of this talk is to show that we are all different with good points and bad. Now, Dr. Hadwen was definitely a controversial figure, but also a man of interest and influence. His legacy includes the founding of Southgate Evangelical Church in Southgate Street and the Hadwen Medical Centre in Abbeydale, which is named after him. So why did this man, that to some was a hero and to others a charlatan, fascinate me so much that I spent many hours researching his life in order to deliver this talk? Well, a number of things had come to my attention, alerting me to certain aspects of his life which touched on my own. For example, I am a Christian and belong to a church associated with the Plymouth Brethren, and that I, like Hadwen, came to Gloucester with a young family for work, having previously lived in Reading, my hometown. During the course of my research, I came across no less than 20 points of similarity which I appeared to share with him. Now, I must quickly point out that not everything in his life matches my experience or philosophy, but I will mention some of these similarities in passing, merely to show how, although we are all different, we are all human with both strengths and weaknesses which should cause us to be careful in our judgment of others. Well, let's get on with the interesting stuff. Much of my information is taken from the book Hadwen of Gloucester, written shortly after his death in 1932 by two ladies, Beatrix Kidd and Edith Richards, who were his close colleagues and ardent fans, to whom he was definitely the hero. So I have had to apply a filter to try and unbias some of their stories and opinions. Also from Dr. Mike Till, who before his retirement was a GP at the Hadwen Medical Practice and is a veritable mine of information on all things Hadwen. Plus Marvin Beggs in history of the Southgate Church, plus numerous other documents, letters and newspaper reports gleaned from the Gloucestershire archives here in Gloucester. And of course the internet, a mine of information on everything. I will be tracing his biography over his 78 years of life to show how his early experiences shaped the strong views he held later in his life. I will occasionally sidetrack to supply some information about his major interests and of course talk about his trial and acquittal on manslaughter charges. This hopefully will show how his strong character and opinions affected those he came into contact with and added to Gloucester's great heritage. So let's look at what shaped his life. The Hadwins are descended from a Danish nobleman who settled in the north of England at the time of the Vikings, 1,000 years ago. The family were living in Lancashire, where Walter's father, William Hadwen, was born in 1819. Now, the Hadwins then came from Lancashire. This is where my daughter's grandchildren and great-grandchildren now live. William Hadwen was expected to become a doctor, the profession of two of his uncles, but his experience in his uncle's surgery, where there was a lot of Victorian blood and guts flowing, put him off medicine, and he went to sea, spending some time fighting in Jamaica. I also spent 4 years of my youth in the Merchant Navy. At the age of 30, William left the sea and came south to Woolwich, obtaining employment at the Royal Marines Infirmary as a chemist and dispenser. Here he met and married Sarah Pendle, the daughter of a Suffolk farmer. It was a happy marriage, but sadly their first child, Charles William, died at the age of 7. Walter Robert Hadwen was a second child born on the 3rd of August 1854, followed by a third son, John Henry. In Woolwich, William Hadwen took his son's education very seriously. His mantra was, duty first and pleasure a long way after. He obtained the services of the hospital chaplain to coach his 2 boys. Walter was a good pupil, and at the age of 7, he could read Latin as well as he could read English. At the age of 13, he passed a preliminary exam for entrance into the Pharmaceutical Society and left his formal schooling, with the advice from his former teacher to never allow himself to do anything that he could not give a good reason for doing. Following this advice, he never smoked. I am a non-smoker. His father had alcohol problems when in the Navy, so promised his wife he would never drink again for the sake of the family, and then went on to found the first temperance society in Woolwich. My wife Hilary and I met on a temperance society summer school when we were young. Walter followed his father's lead and was a total abstainer all his life. At a very young age, when his mother could not go to church, he would deliver a simple sermon to her, the start of his preaching career. I remember doing the same one Sunday morning when my mother was ill in bed and couldn't attend church. Walter's first appearance on a public platform was at his father's temperance society. In 1869, aged 14, he was articled to a chemist named Mr. James at Powis Street, Woolwich. Once he had settled there, his parents moved to Reading, where his father had obtained a post as dispenser at the Royal Berkshire Hospital, leaving the young Walter in Mr. and Mrs. James' care. There was regular correspondence between Walter and his parents, and in one letter he informed them that he had been confirmed by the bishop, attended meetings at the YMCA, but become disillusioned with the Anglican church he was attending when some disparaging remarks were said about the Plymouth Brethren. In a letter to his father, he said he had decided he was definitely low church. About that time, he attended an open-air revival meeting and was very impressed by the preaching of Sir Arthur Blackwood. Now, Sir Arthur was Eton and Cambridge educated, who rose in the ranks of the civil service to be Secretary of the Post Office, a post in which he was highly regarded and was rewarded with a knighthood. He was also an enthusiastic preacher of the gospel. I quote from his biography in the Guardian newspaper. The post office has rarely known a more punctilious and devoted servant, but every hour that he could spare from the one service he devoted to the other, and few preachers have ever addressed so many congregations or striven to spread their faith with more unremitting zeal. Surely this was a model the young Walter adopted for his own professional and spiritual life. The seeds for the transference of his allegiance from the Anglican Church to the Brethren had been sown. But around 1845, there was a major clash of opinions and personalities between the early leaders, which led to a division between open and exclusive assemblies. Despite this, the Brethren movement expanded worldwide, largely through their missionary endeavour. Today, there is no central hierarchy, but rather a loose network of individual assemblies who share their missionary work through an organisation which was called Echoes of Service, but more recently been named as Echoes International. The simplicity of worship and independent thinking of the Brethren appealed to Walter Hadwen and encouraged him to join a local assembly on his move to Reading. At the age of 18, he completed his apprenticeship with Mr. James in Woolwich and became a chemist's assistant in Bedford Square, London. This involved more work and less time to pursue his studies for the further qualification he sought with the Pharmaceutical Society. He spent the Christmas of 1869 with his parents in Reading, which he really enjoyed and was obviously quite impressed with the town. Through his father's contacts, an opening came to work for a chemist called John Wilson in Reading, someone who was willing to assist him in his studies, but also allow him a few weeks' time off to attend the Pharmaceutical College in London in order to take his final exams. So he abandoned earlier thoughts of emigrating to Australia. My wife and I actually lived in Australia for 4 years. And he moved in with his parents and younger. It was known as the Reading question, but it spread worldwide. At the centre of the dispute was Clarence Esme Stewart. He was one of the elders of the Reading Assembly, also a descendant of the royal house of Stuart, and said to have had a remarkable resemblance to Charles I before he lost his head, of course. The young Walter Hadwen applied his inquiring mind in the arguments and felt the issue could be resolved by sensible discussion. To this end, he wrote papers and letters, giving his input to the debate, but these were rejected by the church elders, who were probably upset by this young whippersnapper who thought he could solve such deep spiritual matters. Walter realised that he was out of place in that assembly, so he left to start his own mission work in the town. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to trace exactly where that was, but I'm still pursuing some interesting leads. Where it joins the River Thames. He enjoyed rowing on the Thames, I also enjoyed life on that river in my teenage years as a member of the Sea Scouts and the school rowing club. It was at this time that he became a vegetarian. He gave up eating meat for 6 months for a wager and felt the better for it. So after researching the subject, he gave up eating meat, fish or fowl for the rest of his life. In 1877, he went to London to prepare for and to sit his final chemistry examination. During that time, he met and fell in love with Alice Harrell. Now, she was one of two daughters of Dr. Francis Harrell, a man of independent means who, although qualified in medicine, never actually practiced it. He just studied it out of interest. With his newfound love, Walter could no longer stay settled in Reading, so he obtained a post as a manager of a pharmacy in Clapham. Among his customers were author Charles Kingsley, who he liked, and the wife of Charles Dickens, who he didn't like. After a whirlwind 6 months courtship, Walter and Alice were married on March 26, 1878. He was 23 years old. Yes, I too was married at 23. After their honeymoon, they moved to Highbridge in Somerset, where he had purchased a wholesale and retail chemist business. My sister lived in neighbouring Burnham, but not at the same time, of course. The couple lived at 26 Market Place, conveniently situated facing the market where many farmers gathered on marking days and came to him for medication for themselves and sometimes for their animals. His business prospered and his standing in the local community grew. Walter's evangelistic zeal had not diminished in the moves, and he sought an avenue to exercise his Christian ministry in Highbridge. Although there was a Baptist church just round the corner in Church Street, he chose not to attend there, but to start his own mission work. He gave a series of lectures at the adult school on the Sunday afternoons, which were well attended. He was developing effective speaking skills, and his Bible teaching was fresh and something new to the local citizens. On Sunday mornings, he hired a room in nearby Clyce Road and later obtained a site for and built a mission hall, and later in Newtown Road, which was used for many years by a Brethren assembly, but unfortunately became derelict and was demolished just a few years ago. While the hall was being built, he preached in the open air in the market square on Sunday evenings. His reputation as a Bible teacher spread into the nearby towns and villages where his preaching was in much demand. Medicine today is far removed from the more primitive practices of 100 and more years ago. Epidemics and plagues occurred regularly, and many people died due to ignorance of the causes and spread of disease. Many things we take for granted today, of course, were not known about, and things which even cause harm, like bleeding with leeches, was a common practice. In the 18th century, there were outbreaks of smallpox all over this country. The practice of inoculation was well recognized and first used to fight smallpox by the ancient Greeks. By giving a patient a mild dose of smallpox might prevent death, but it was also a bit hit and miss depending on the amount administered. This practice was called variolation. Now, before we go any further, let's just look at a few terminologies Edward Jenner was a country practitioner in Berkeley, here in Gloucestershire. He discovered that if a person had contracted cowpox, which is a similar disease to smallpox, but normally only affecting cows, but it could also be passed on to those who work with cows, they would not get smallpox. In 1796, he took matters from a dairymaid called Sarah Nelms, who had the cowpox, and inoculated a boy, James Phipps, with it. Later, he inoculated the boy with matter from a patient who had smallpox, but it didn't give him the disease. Vaccination was then invented. There are a few hiccups on the way at the beginning, but by the turn of the century, 1800, the process became widespread, and today smallpox is now completely eradicated worldwide. In 1977, the last reported case of naturally occurring smallpox was reported in Somalia. In the UK, a law was passed in 1849 banning the practice of variolation, and in 1853, all children were required by law to be vaccinated within their first 3 months. Parents who did not comply were liable to a fine or imprisonment. In 1867, compliance was extended to the age of 14. Despite this, vaccinations were not always successful, and there were many opposed to the practice on the grounds of morality, ethics, effectiveness, or safety. Not all objections were taken seriously. And I have the scar to prove it. Bristol University Medical School for the autumn term. Travelling to Bristol each day was difficult but manageable. His parents moved from Reading to Highbridge so that his father could keep the business going in his absence, but he did retain his responsibilities at the mission hall. He was again a good student, helped no doubt by his experience of life to date. He won many prizes for his endeavours, including gold medals for medicine and surgery. After completing his studies in Bristol, he moved to St Bartholomew's in London to study surgery and Queen Charlotte's Hospital for midwifery. Oh, one of my daughters is a surgeon and trained at Bart's. The qualifications he gained in 1893 made him a licentiate of the Society of Apothecaries, LSA, a member of the Royal College of Surgeons, MRCS, and a licentiate of the Royal College of Physicians, LRCP, entitling him to be called Doctor. The newly qualified Dr. Hadwen settled back into Highbridge society, selling his business and opening up his own medical practice in the town. Already with some 10 years standing in the community for his business acumen, he then earned further respect from his patients and fellow citizens as a medical practitioner over the next few years. When the Hadwens finally left Highbridge after 18.5 years for Gloucester in October 1896, the Gloucester Journal reported a grand send-off at the adult school Highbridge, when gifts and videos of votes of thanks were given by the grateful townsfolk, students from his first day classes, and friends from the Brethren Assembly. Gloucester and the 1896 smallpox epidemic. We now come to the more controversial part of our story. I'll try to be objective, but that is not always easy, although with hindsight, we can often see things clearer than we can at the time they occur. Now, there are two sides to every argument. I'll try to present them both with regard to vaccination and leave you to come to your own conclusions if you haven't done already. 100 years after Jenner's breakthrough with the vaccination process, the last major outbreak of smallpox in this country occurred in Gloucester. The facts are that in the summer of 1895, when the epidemic broke, some 85% of the population of Gloucester had not been vaccinated, making Gloucester the least vaccinated city in the country. There are a number of reasons for Gloucester's folk being opposed to the procedure. The strongest one of these was a civil liberties issue, of parents not having the right to make their own decisions with relation to their children. There were also objections on religious grounds and the use of diseased animal products being introduced to healthy children. It wasn't a question of cost, because the process was carried out free of charge. There was also the fear that infection of minor disease may develop into a major one once implanted and even possibly lead to death. Once the epidemic started to take hold, the Gloucester Medical Officer of Health at the time, Dr. John Campbell, recommended a programme of vaccination for all those who would take it. But this wasn't immediately taken up. At the same time, the anti-vaccinators like Dr. Hadwen were encouraging the population not to cooperate. Although at this time he was still in Highbridge, he was quite aware of what was happening in Gloucester and paid many visits to the city, addressing public meetings to enthusiastic audiences and writing letters to the press to put his point of view. And his view was that the real cause of the epidemic was the lack of good sanitation and poor housing in the city, causing what had started as an isolated case developing into a full-scale epidemic. And there is some strength in this argument. As the Widden School area of town, where 21 of the 300 children in the infant department died, was particularly lacking in sanitation and good water supply. It is worth reminding ourselves that in those days it was thought that disease was spread by bad air. Germ theory was a largely mistrusted new way of thinking. It was not until the construction of the Panama Canal at the start of the 20th century that it was realized that it was bad water that contributed most to the spread of disease. Hadwen believed that if smallpox patients received good medical care, they would recover without recourse to vaccination. He put his case most forcefully and was believed by many of the ordinary people of Gloucester. Thus his strong personality and the belief in his own carefully researched views, which might otherwise be considered as one of his strong points, made him appear to the medical establishment as arrogant. Despite his protests, the adoption of the program of mass vaccination did cause the subsiding of the disease. However, although many people agreed to be vaccinated at the time, after the epidemic was over, the general population reverted to their non-acceptance of vaccination. As a result of Dr. Hadwen's strong influence during the epidemic and his alternative methods of dealing with the sick, he was invited by a large number of citizens to move to Gloucester. In October 1896, Dr. Hadwen, then aged 41, this leaflet shows a Mr. Pickering's claim for the hydrotherapy treatment for smallpox, but as far as we know, he had no connection with the Hadwins. Hadwen opened a surgery at 139 Barton Street. Conveniently, the shop next door was a chemist. He ran this surgery as a sole practice until his death in 1832. He ran it as a sole practitioner. Dr. Mike Till wondered how on earth he managed to travel all around the country giving lectures and still run a single doctor practice. Of course, there was no NHS in those days, but his patients could join the practice medical club, where poorer families could pay, in 1934, 3 and 6pence each week to cover treatment they might need at any time. Private patients paid 3 shillings to 5 shillings for a home visit and were billed when treated. Dr. Hadwen was generous with his time and quickly established himself as a caring doctor, proving popular with his patients. In 1897, he undertook an oral examination at St Andrews University in Scotland for the award of the degree of MD, Doctor of Medicine. This was a qualification for registered medical practitioners over the age of 40, and if they were vouched for by at least 3 medical men of acknowledged repute in their profession. He was successful in examination and was awarded the degree. Back in Gloucester, he quickly immersed himself into activities within his new community. Having previously researched the sanitation problems in the city before his arrival, he was instrumental in bringing about improvements to the sanitation in South Gloucester. He associated himself with the local schools and brought about change to the welfare of the pupils, recommending domestic science for the girls and carpentry for the boys, and he taught them scripture. In 1898, he was elected as a councillor for the Barton ward. 1901, he purchased a hall in Nelson Street, Tredworth, from local builders Sessions and Fielding as a mission. A Sunday school gospel meeting and mothers' meeting were run under the supervision of the Southgate Assembly. This building still stands and is the present home of the Bethlehem Gospel Church, as you will see here. When he died, he bequeathed the building to the Albion Hall trustees. In 1906, the Southgate Fellowship had outgrown Gleveham Hall. He loved animals. Over the years, he had many dogs and cats, and once a tortoise and a rat. Although there have always been people who love animals, in the past they were mainly kept for practical purposes, such as beasts of burden, catchers of rats, or herders of sheep, etc. With the Industrial Revolution, we began to depend less on animals in that way and more on technology. Now, of course, we keep domestic animals as pets and are more sympathetic to their needs. However, as more and more discoveries in medicine were made, the practice of using animals as test beds increased, causing concern from many for their welfare. As a result of the positive feedback received, she invited him to join the society, and he became an ardent advocate for the movement, speaking with his persuasive powers at public meetings around the country. When she died suddenly in 1904, aged 81, he took over as head of the organisation and campaigned tirelessly for the cause for the rest of his life.
Vivisection is not only cruel, it is utterly useless. Medical students are taught that practically all the knowledge upon which the practice of medicine and surgery is based has come through the pathway of experimentation upon living animals. This is entirely false. Let us take some examples. The knowledge of the circulation of the blood is claimed as one of its triumphs. But when Harvey, at the close of his career, was asked by his biographer, the Honourable Robert Boyle, what really led him to believe that the blood circulated, he replied that it was his examination of the valves in the veins of a dead subject.
When the Hadwins moved to Gloucester in 1896, Walter and Alice had 3 children: Una, aged 16, John, aged 12, and Grace, 9. As I said before, I also moved to Gloucester for employment with my wife and young family. We too have 3 children, and like the Hadwins, 2 daughters and a son. Una trained as an electrocutionist, get that right? Grace became a masseuse and took over the running of the hydro and medical home until her marriage, when the home closed and the family took over the whole house as a private residence. Son John trained as a doctor like his father and served in the Royal Navy during the First World War as a lieutenant commander. In 1918, towards the end of the war, he was in medical command of 3 vessels in mid-Pacific when an influenza epidemic swept through the ships. He worked tirelessly to bring his sailors back to health, but he himself caught pneumonia, died, and was buried in San Diego. The news of the death of his only son brought Dr. Hadwen and the family back in Gloucester great sadness. Later, when he toured America, he was able to visit his son's grave. His daughter Grace was married in the Albion Hall, which was licensed especially for that occasion. He loved the Cotswolds, and once in 1909, whilst out cycling with his daughter Una, discovered a vacant 18th century cottage in the village of Pitchcombe, just outside Gloucester. He bought the property. It became his bolt hole, somewhere to escape from his busy life. He built a mock ancient ruin, which was known as the ruins of Pitchcombe, Abbey. It is no longer there, of course. Hadwin's had a mixed relationship with the medical establishment in Gloucester. On the one hand, he was a good doctor and well respected for the general medical well-being of his patients and his civic work. On the other hand, his views on vaccination and vivisection in particular set him apart from most of his medical colleagues. They had not forgotten the 1896 smallpox epidemic and his opposition to vaccination, which he continued to promote. A rumour actually was spread that during the epidemic, he secretly had gone to Cheltenham with his children, where they were all vaccinated. Despite that, he had never visited Cheltenham at that time. Rumours have a habit of spreading, and this was still being bandied about in 1923, even being circulated in Canada and America. False news, fake news. In 1923, there was a smallpox outbreak in the Midlands, which spread down to Gloucester. Memories of the 1896 epidemic prompted speculation that when cases of smallpox, although mild, were reported in the city, and the fact that only 10% of babies had been vaccinated in the previous 3 years, fears were raised. Dr. Hadwen and a number of other doctors, including the Gloucester Medical of Health Dr. Bibby, denied that the output of the disease was smallpox, considering it to be chickenpox, a much less virulent disease. However, the National Ministry of Health, fearful a smallpox epidemic would spread to other parts of the country, sent their smallpox experts to Gloucester to ensure preventative measures were put in place. Dr. Bibby resigned and was replaced by a young Dr. Davidson from Birmingham to ensure who Dr. Hadwen considered to be inexperienced. However, Dr. Davidson set up stations around the city and encouraged people to be vaccinated. This, of course, was discouraged by anti-vaccination Hadwen. A smallpox isolation hospital was set up at the airport in Brockworth, and anyone who was diagnosed with or even suspected of having the disease was sent there. Panic escalated, and though not official policy but encouraged by the local and national press, people were advised not to travel to Gloucester. In the event, it was a false alarm, and almost all the cases of smallpox that were confirmed were of a mild nature. In later years, when more research had been carried out into smallpox, it was discovered that there were two types of smallpox, variola major and variola minor. Gloucester had escaped with the minor version. It was not an epidemic. Perhaps the most significant event in Dr. Walter Hadwen's life occurred in the summer of 1924. At his trial, the Crown prosecution claimed that he should have spotted diphtheria and given an antitoxin to immunize Nellie, which of course would have been against his principles to do. But was it diphtheria? Hadwen was convinced it was pneumonia, but what might have caused the pneumonia? It transpired, through the witness of a neighbour, that on the night before Nellie's condition had worsened, and while her mother was out, she had gone out of bed, gone down to the cold scullery in her nightdress, in bare feet, to get a drink of water. This may well have caused her to get a chill in a weakened state, which brought on the pneumonia. Dr. Ellis was adamant that Nellie had diphtheria, and this was supported by the deputy coroner who conducted the post-mortem. However, it came to light that sometime earlier Dr. Ellis had written to two national newspapers, the Daily Express and the Daily Mail, accusing Dr. Hadwen of not being entitled to the qualifications that he claimed. Now, this was so libelous that the papers refused to print it. The reluctance of Dr. Ellis under cross-examination to admit that he had made this defamatory statement put a question mark over his reliability as a witness. The case hung on two things. Did Nellie actually have diphtheria, which Hadwen had misdiagnosed as tonsillitis due to his own conventional medical views, in which case the pneumonia would have been brought on by the diphtheria, which then caused her death? Or was it really tonsillitis, the pneumonia developing only after getting a chill from the visit to the cold kitchen? In that case, diphtheria must have been misdiagnosed by Dr. Ellis and the post-mortem. The judge was very fair in his summing up, reminding the jury that to convict manslaughter, they must be convinced that Dr. Hadwen had acted in a criminally unprofessional way. It only took the jury 20 minutes to come to their not guilty verdict. The court erupted into prolonged cheering, much to the judge's annoyance. Now, I've tried to be objective in this summary, but there was a lot of technical argument over the symptoms, and you may have your own views on it. Of necessity, I've given a very truncated version of the proceedings. But if you want all the details, a copy of the verbatim report of the trial is available to read in the Gloucestershire Archives at the Heritage Hub here in Gloucester. The trial did take a toll on his health, but after it, Dr. Hadwen got back on with his work and civic duties. He was to have 8 more years of life, and during that time he fulfilled a long-held wish to travel. In 1926, he set off for a round-the-world cruise on the new Cunard liner, the Frankovia, visiting Europe, the Middle East, India, the Far East, America, and back home again. Of course, you guessed it. I too, whilst in the Merchant Navy, have circumnavigated the globe by ship and in the same direction. During his travels, he sent back regular articles which were published in the Citizen for the Gloucester citizens to read. In December 1932, Dr. Walter Robert Hadwen collapsed on his way to the Albion Hall for a meeting. His health then deteriorated over the following days with increased breathlessness. He took to his bed, where he stayed. He dictated a sermon for the Christmas Day service, which he was unable to attend. Old Treadworth Cemetery, where he was buried close to the chapel there. His wife Alice died 6 months later. Unfortunately, his memorial stone is now somewhat overgrown. In 1929, Dr. James Horsley did a locum for Dr. Hadwen and was invited by him to be his successor when he retired, as he shared many of Hadwen's views. He took over the practice in 1933 after Dr. Hadwen's death. Over the years, the practice moved from Barton Street to Park Road. added another surgery in St Michael's Square, and eventually in 1984 moved out into the suburbs of Abbeydale, calling it the Hadwen Medical Centre in his memory. This year, or a couple of years ago now, I think, this year a newly extended surgery opened there and is now named Hadwen Health. So how can we sum up the life of this remarkable, if somewhat controversial man? As I said at the start of this talk, I like biographies because they tell of how other people live and how they face the challenges that life presents. I've dropped in a number of the ways in which my life reflected certain aspects of Walter Hadwen's life. And you may be thinking that I was offering you proof of reincarnation. But let me quickly say, there are many things about his life which I do not share. I'm not anti-vaccination, not a vegetarian, and a bit undecided about vivisection, although I do share his Christian faith. But we are all different with our own strengths and weaknesses. He was a very strong character, knowing what he believed and sticking to it, although I suspect that if he were alive today and knew of the eradication of smallpox throughout the world due to vaccination, he might well have changed his mind on that one. But reading his correspondence and his dealings with other people, I believe that though he had strong opinions which he held firmly, he did respect others as people, if not their views. Having strong opinions but not being opinionated is something I would like to emulate. But what do you make of his life? Was he a hero or was he a charlatan? Probably somewhere in between. One thing we can say is that he certainly made an impressive impact on Gloucester, leaving us the two legacies to remember him by: the church in Southgate Street and Hadwen Health in Abbeydale. Thank you for listening.